He thought removing her from the room would prove who held the power, but within the next 10 minutes, every billionaire at that table would realize they had just humiliated the one woman capable of destroying the entire deal with a single sentence. The ballroom conference suite on the 42nd floor of the Blackstone Meridian Hotel overlooked the cold silver skyline of Manhattan, where winter clouds hung low over the Hudson River and the city lights reflected against endless sheets of glass. Inside the private executive chamber, the air smelled faintly of espresso, expensive leather, and polished marble. 12 of the world's most influential financial leaders sat around a table carved from dark walnut imported from Italy, discussing a global infrastructure merger worth nearly $14 billion. Men and women in tailored Navy suits spoke in calm, measured voices about market leverage, international shipping routes, and government contracts, while assistants moved quietly across the edges of the room like shadows trained never to interrupt power. Then the elevator doors opened at the end of the hall, and Claire Whitmore stepped out carrying a worn brown handbag that looked older than some of the junior analysts inside the building. She wore a simple cream-colored sweater beneath a charcoal coat, low heels softened by years of use, and a thin silver watch with scratches near the clasp. Her blonde hair, streaked lightly with gray, rested neatly against her shoulders. Nothing about her appearance suggested wealth, influence, or authority. In a building filled with private jets, billion-dollar negotiations, and political alliances, she looked like someone's quiet aunt arriving early for church on Sunday. The young receptionist near the entrance glanced at Claire's printed invitation twice before forcing a polite smile. "The Investor Summit is upstairs," he said carefully, assuming she had wandered into the wrong level. Claire simply nodded. "I know." Her voice remained calm and almost gentle. As she walked toward the conference suite, several executives waiting outside briefly looked up from their phones before dismissing her completely. One man whispered something under his breath that made another laugh softly. Claire heard it. She kept walking anyway. Inside the conference room, Richard Hale stood near the head of the table reviewing projected financial models on a massive digital screen stretching across the wall. At 58, Richard carried himself with the relaxed confidence of a man who had spent decades being obeyed immediately. Silver cufflinks flashed beneath the lights each time he moved his hands. He did not notice Claire enter at first. Nobody announced her. Nobody stood to greet her. The only sound was the low murmur of elite conversation and the soft tapping of crystal glasses against polished stone countertops near the bar. Claire quietly chose the final empty chair near the end of the table. A junior assistant approached her almost immediately. "Ma'am, I think this section is reserved for principal stakeholders." Several people nearby smiled politely without looking directly at her. Claire folded her gloves carefully into her lap. "I understand," she replied. "That's why I'm here." The assistant hesitated, uncertain whether to argue further. Before he could speak again, Richard finally glanced down the table and froze for half a second when he saw the unfamiliar woman seated among the investors. His expression tightened almost invisibly. Not anger, not confusion, something colder. Embarrassment. To him, Claire Whitmore looked like a mistake someone forgot to correct before the meeting began. And in rooms like this, powerful people hated mistakes. Richard Hale did not ask who Claire Whitmore was. Men like Richard rarely asked questions when they believed they already knew the answer. He simply looked toward Daniel Brooks near the center of the table and gave a small, impatient gesture, the kind powerful executives used when they wanted problems removed quietly before important guests noticed them. Daniel leaned toward a conference coordinator standing against the wall. "Can somebody verify her credentials?" he whispered, though not quietly enough to prevent the nearest investors from hearing. Claire remained seated, her hands folded calmly over a slim leather notebook, while the giant digital screen behind Richard shifted through charts filled with projected growth percentages and international shipping forecasts. Nobody offered Claire water. Nobody handed her the printed merger packets distributed moments earlier around the table. One by one, crystal glasses were placed carefully beside every executive except her. The exclusion was subtle enough to remain deniable and obvious enough to be intentional. Across the room, Victoria Lang crossed one leg slowly and studied Claire with thinly disguised irritation. Victoria represented one of the largest private banking groups in Europe and carried herself with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to deciding who belonged in elite rooms and who did not. Her diamond bracelet reflected against the overhead lights each time she adjusted her tablet. "This meeting is restricted to primary stakeholders," Victoria finally said without looking directly at Claire. Perhaps there was confusion downstairs. Claire lifted her eyes politely. "I do not believe there was." A faint silence settled over the table. Richard continued speaking as though the interruption had already been handled. "As I was saying, once the Singapore corridor is finalized, we expect annual returns to exceed 11% within 36 months. The screen changed again. Numbers glowed blue against the darkened wall. Several executives nodded approvingly while assistants typed notes near the edges of the room. Claire glanced briefly at one projection before speaking in a soft, almost conversational tone. "That estimate assumes the Port Dominion litigation will not reopen." The room paused. Richard stopped mid-sentence for less than a second before recovering. "The litigation issue was resolved 2 years ago." Claire tilted her head slightly. "Publicly, yes." A few eyes shifted toward her now. Not with respect, with annoyance. Ethan Mercer, a technology investor from California, let out a restrained laugh. "Interesting observation," he said. "Do you specialize in maritime law?" Claire looked at him calmly. No, she offered nothing more. The silence after her answer lingered longer than expected. Richard pressed a button on the table, returning control of the conversation to himself. "Moving on," he said sharply. But something had changed. The atmosphere inside the room no longer felt effortless. Small glances began passing between executives. One investor quietly minimized a financial projection on his tablet and reopened legal exposure reports instead. Another leaned toward his assistant and whispered something with a tightened expression. Claire noticed all of it without reacting. A server entered carrying a tray of champagne flutes. He moved around the table carefully, placing drinks beside each guest. When he reached Claire, he hesitated after noticing she had no nameplate in front of her seat. Before he could decide what to do, Richard spoke without even turning his head. "Not there." The server immediately stepped away. Nobody challenged it. Nobody looked surprised. Claire simply reached for the cup of black coffee sitting alone beside her notebook. Steam rose quietly beneath the cold conference lighting. She thanked the server anyway. The young man blinked once, almost embarrassed for reasons he could not explain. Then he hurried away. At the far end of the room, the city skyline faded behind gathering snow clouds while inside the billion-dollar meeting, the only person remaining calm was the woman everyone had already decided did not belong there. By the time the meeting entered its second hour, the atmosphere inside the conference suite had become colder than the snow beginning to fall beyond the glass walls overlooking Manhattan. Richard Hale stood at the front of the room with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to controlling every outcome before the conversation even began. His voice carried evenly across the polished chamber as charts shifted behind him, displaying maps of international trade corridors stretching across Europe, Asia, and the United States. "Once the Atlantic consolidation is approved," Richard said, "we will effectively control 30% of commercial infrastructure movement between North America and Southeast Asia." Several executives nodded with quiet satisfaction. Pens moved across leather notebooks. Expensive watches flashed beneath the recessed lighting. Around the table, billions of dollars rested behind calm expressions and carefully measured smiles. Claire Whitmore remained silent near the end of the room, listening while steam slowly disappeared from the untouched coffee beside her hand. To most people there, she still looked invisible. Richard preferred it that way. "The board in Singapore has already guaranteed preliminary cooperation," Daniel Brooks added while adjusting his cufflinks. "There should be minimal resistance." Claire looked up from her notebook. "That is not what their legal counsel believes." Her voice was calm enough that several people almost missed the sentence entirely. Richard stopped walking. For a moment, only the faint hum of the digital projector could be heard. Victoria Lang leaned back slowly in her chair. Ethan Mercer glanced sideways toward Claire with growing irritation. Richard smiled politely, but the warmth never reached his eyes. "And how exactly would you know what their legal counsel believes?" he asked. Claire folded one page of her notebook carefully before answering. "Because they submitted objections 48 hours ago." Silence spread across the room again. This time it lasted longer. Daniel immediately turned toward one of his assistants. Did we receive updated filings? The assistant checked his tablet quickly, confusion appearing across his face. Not through the public channels. Claire lowered her eyes again, as though the matter no longer interested her. Richard studied her carefully now. The woman who had seemed harmless 30 minutes earlier had begun creating something dangerous inside the room. Uncertainty. Powerful people could tolerate disagreement. They could not tolerate uncertainty. Richard moved closer to the table, forcing a relaxed laugh. There are always rumors before major acquisitions, he said. That is why experienced investors avoid overreacting. Claire nodded once. Experienced investors also avoid underestimating risk. The sentence landed softly, but several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Victoria finally spoke with a sharper tone than before. Forgive me, but we still do not know who you are. Claire met her gaze without emotion. No, she said quietly. You do not. A hush settled across the room after those words. Even the assistants standing along the walls sensed the tension tightening beneath the polished professionalism. Richard pressed his palm lightly against the conference table. This meeting involves highly sensitive financial negotiations, he said. If there has been some administrative misunderstanding, we can resolve it privately outside. Claire looked toward the massive city skyline beyond the windows where gray snow clouds drifted between skyscrapers. Then she returned her attention to Richard. I am exactly where I am supposed to be. The calm certainty in her voice unsettled him more than open defiance ever could have. Because deep down, Richard Hale had spent his entire career reading people within seconds. Wealth recognized wealth. Influence recognized influence. But Claire Whitmore gave him nothing. No nervousness. No desperation. No attempt to impress anyone in the room. And for the first time that morning, Richard began to suspect the quiet woman at the end of the table might not be the mistake he believed she was. The tension inside the conference suite no longer felt subtle. It moved quietly beneath every conversation now, like a crack spreading underneath polished ice, while nobody wanted to be the first person to acknowledge it. Richard Hale returned to the front of the room with controlled confidence, but the rhythm of the meeting had changed in ways he could no longer fully command. Every few minutes, someone glanced toward Claire Whitmore at the far end of the table. Not because she demanded attention, because she did not. That calm unsettled them more than arrogance ever could have. The digital presentation shifted to projected expansion routes across Southeast Asia, while snow drifted steadily outside the towering windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan. Once the acquisition closes, Richard said, we will have unrestricted shipping authority through all partnered ports within 18 months. Claire slowly lifted her eyes from her notebook. 17, she said quietly. Richard stopped speaking again. A faint crease appeared near his jaw. Excuse me. Claire looked toward the screen. The Jakarta Authority agreement expires in 17 months unless renewed before the second quarter review. Ethan Mercer frowned immediately and began typing rapidly into his tablet. Daniel Brooks checked another file beside him. Victoria crossed her arms tightly, but said nothing. Richard forced a small smile. That renewal has already been discussed. Claire nodded once. Discussed is not the same as approved. The room fell silent yet again. One of the younger analysts near the wall accidentally dropped his pen against the marble floor, the sharp sound echoing louder than it should have in the stillness. Richard walked slowly toward the center of the table. You seem unusually informed for someone who has not introduced herself properly. Claire met his gaze calmly. Perhaps introductions are not the problem in this room. The sentence landed softly, but several people looked down immediately after hearing it. Nobody wanted to acknowledge what was becoming painfully obvious. The quiet woman they had dismissed since morning understood the deal better than many executives sitting around the table. Richard noticed it too, and he hated it. Powerful men often built their authority through perception long before results. Richard controlled rooms because people believed he belonged at the center of them. But Claire Whitmore sat quietly at the edge of the table without demanding recognition, and somehow the gravity inside the room kept shifting toward her anyway. Victoria leaned forward at last. Who are you connected to? She asked bluntly. Which firm sent you? Claire remained silent for a moment while snowflakes drifted slowly against the glass behind her. A long time ago, she finally said, someone taught me that the people with the least need to impress others are usually the ones worth listening to. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose, frustrated now. That is not an answer. Claire gave the faintest hint of a smile. No, she replied softly. It is not. Richard turned toward one of the conference coordinators standing near the entrance. Please verify her credentials immediately. The coordinator hesitated. We already scanned her invitation downstairs, sir. Then verify it again. The young man nodded nervously and left the room. Claire did not react at all. She simply reached for her coffee while the executives around her exchanged increasingly uneasy glances. Daniel Brooks lowered his voice toward Richard. How does she know all this? Richard did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Claire. For the first time that morning, he began reviewing every second since she entered the room. The receptionist confusion, the missing nameplate, the absence of visible credentials, the complete lack of fear. Then something else disturbed him even more. Claire had never once tried to prove she belonged there. It was almost as if she had walked into the room already knowing she did not need anyone's permission. The conference room had become too quiet for comfort. Even the executives who spent their lives negotiating billion-dollar agreements now avoided speaking unless necessary, as though everyone sensed something sitting beneath the surface that had not fully revealed itself yet. Snow continued drifting across the Manhattan skyline outside, while muted gray light pressed against the towering windows surrounding the private suite. Richard Hale stood near the center of the table with one hand resting against polished walnut, his patience thinning beneath the controlled expression he fought to maintain. Claire Whitmore sat motionless at the far end of the room, her posture relaxed, her coffee untouched now for nearly 20 minutes. She looked less like a guest than someone waiting for other people to finally understand something obvious. The conference coordinator returned quietly through the double doors carrying a tablet. Richard immediately looked toward him. Well, the young man hesitated. Her invitation is valid, sir. A faint murmur spread across the room. Richard narrowed his eyes. Valid through which office? It came directly from the executive authorization system. Daniel Brooks frowned. Whose authorization? The coordinator swallowed nervously. The record is restricted. Nobody spoke for several seconds after that. Victoria. Lang slowly lowered her pen onto the table. Ethan Mercer stared toward Claire with visible frustration now, no longer amused by her presence. Richard finally let out a quiet breath through his nose before forcing another professional smile. There must be some internal confusion, he said. These systems occasionally process administrative errors. Claire looked toward him calmly. You seem very eager for that to be true. The sentence struck harder than Richard expected. Around the table, several executives exchanged uncertain glances again. The room no longer viewed Claire as harmless. Now they viewed her as disruptive. And for powerful people, disruption was often treated like a threat. Richard straightened his jacket slowly. Miss Whitmore, he said with colder formality. This meeting involves confidential negotiations between senior stakeholders and founding partners. If you are unable to clearly explain your role here, I am going to ask security to escort you outside until this matter is resolved. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody defended her. The assistants along the walls lowered their eyes toward their tablets while silence spread across the marble and glass room like a heavy curtain. Claire remained completely still. Then she asked a question so calm it almost sounded gentle. Before you do that, Mr. Hale, may I ask whether you personally reviewed the final Singapore exposure report? Richard blinked once, caught off guard by the sudden shift. That is irrelevant. Did you? She repeated quietly. Daniel Brooks looked toward Richard immediately. Victoria stopped moving altogether. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. Our legal division reviewed every relevant document. Claire nodded once. Then your legal division failed you. The sentence landed like cold steel across the room. Ethan leaned forward sharply. You do not walk into a private summit and insult an entire executive board. Claire turned toward him with the same calm expression she had carried since morning. I did not insult them, she said softly. I warned them. The room went silent again. Richard felt the meeting slipping farther from his control with every passing minute, and men like him rarely tolerated losing control in front of other powerful people. He pressed a button near the edge of the table. Moments later, 2 hotel security officers appeared quietly outside the conference doors. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Claire finally looked toward the entrance, then back at Richard. There was no fear in her eyes. No panic. No embarrassment. only disappointment. And somehow, that expression unsettled Richard Hale more than anger ever could have. Because deep down, he was beginning to realize something impossible. Truly powerless people did not remain that calm when an entire room turned against them. The two hotel security officers stopped just inside the conference entrance, their polished shoes reflecting faintly against the marble floor while the room watched in complete silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The executives seated around the massive walnut table avoided looking directly at Claire Whitmore now, as though acknowledging her too openly might somehow expose their own uncertainty. Outside the windows, snow drifted slowly over Manhattan, softening the city skyline beneath pale gray afternoon light. Richard Hale kept his posture straight and composed, but tension had begun settling visibly into his face. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, "I am asking one final time. Explain your presence here." Claire looked toward him with the same calm expression she had carried since entering the room hours earlier. "You already know why I am here," she replied softly. Richard's patience finally cracked beneath the pressure of the room. "No," he said sharply. "I do not." One of the security officers stepped forward politely. "Ma'am, we may need you to come with us while this gets sorted out." Claire slowly reached into her handbag. Several people around the table stiffened instinctively, expecting credentials or legal documents. Instead, she removed a small folded photograph with worn edges. Quietly, she placed it on the polished table near the center of the room. Richard frowned. Victoria leaned forward slightly. The photograph showed an older image of three people standing beside a construction site decades earlier. One young man wore a hard hat. Another held blueprints beneath his arm. Between them stood a much younger Claire Whitmore, smiling faintly beneath the bright summer sun. Daniel Brooks narrowed his eyes. "Wait," he whispered. Richard looked closer. Then his expression changed. Not fully, just enough for the room to notice. Because the young man standing beside Claire in the photograph was Thomas Whitaker, the deceased founder whose empire eventually became Meridian Global Infrastructure, one of the most powerful private investment networks in the world. The very company behind the merger sitting before them now. Nobody spoke. Claire rested her hands quietly together again. "Thomas believed character mattered more than appearances," she said softly. "He repeated that often." Ethan Mercer looked confused. "You knew Thomas Whitaker?" Claire turned toward him calmly. "I built shipping routes with Thomas before most people in this room graduated college." A hush fell over the conference suite. Richard stared at the photograph another moment before forcing himself to step back emotionally. "That still does not explain your authority here." Claire looked directly into his eyes for the first time since the meeting began. "No," she said quietly. "It explains yours." Before Richard could respond, the conference room telephone suddenly rang. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. Every head turned toward the center console built into the table. Daniel looked down immediately at the incoming caller display, and the color drained from his face. "It is headquarters," he murmured. Richard grabbed the receiver quickly, eager to regain control of the room. Richard Hale speaking. The voice on the other end sounded cold, direct, and unmistakably alarmed. "Richard," the caller said, "why are there security officers in the executive summit?" Richard glanced briefly toward Claire. "There has been a credential issue involving an unidentified attendee." Several seconds of silence followed. Then the voice spoke again, lower this time. "Unidentified." Richard's confidence began slipping for the first time all day. "Yes." Another silence. Heavy. Dangerous. Then came the sentence. That froze every person inside the room. "Richard, do you have any idea who you are trying to remove from that table?" Nobody moved. Even the security officers remained completely still near the doorway. Richard slowly lowered the receiver from his ear, just enough to look toward Claire Whitmore again. And for the first time since she entered the room, the most powerful man there no longer looked irritated. He looked afraid. The silence inside the conference suite became unbearable after the call from headquarters. Nobody touched their drinks anymore. Nobody looked at the presentation screen. The billion-dollar merger that had dominated the room all morning suddenly felt irrelevant compared to the quiet woman seated near the end of the table. Richard Hale remained standing with the phone still pressed against his ear, while the voice from headquarters continued speaking in a tone stripped completely of patience. "Richard," the executive voice said, "I suggest you lower your voice. dismiss security immediately, and listen very carefully to Mrs. Whitmore. Richard swallowed once before answering. There must be some misunderstanding. No, the voice replied coldly. The misunderstanding is yours. Around the table, executives exchanged increasingly nervous glances. Daniel Brooks slowly removed his glasses. Victoria Lang sat completely still now, her earlier confidence fading into visible discomfort. Even Ethan Mercer no longer looked irritated. He looked cautious. Richard lowered the receiver slightly. Why was I never informed? Because her involvement is protected under founder-level confidentiality agreements. The sentence landed heavily across the room. Founder level. Nobody spoke after hearing those words. The voice continued. Claire Whitmore holds final veto authority over the Singapore consolidation and every attached infrastructure transfer connected to this merger. Richard's face lost color. Several people around the table visibly stiffened. One assistant near the wall stopped typing altogether. Claire remained calm, her hands folded gently together while snow continued drifting beyond the glass skyline behind her. The executive on the phone spoke. One final sentence before disconnecting. If she walks away from this deal, Richard, there will not be a deal. The line went dead. Richard lowered the receiver slowly into its cradle. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed willing to breathe too loudly. Then, almost instantly, the atmosphere inside the room changed. The same people who had ignored Claire hours earlier now looked toward her with stunned recognition. Victoria sat straighter in her chair. Daniel quickly opened new financial projections on his tablet. One of the assistants quietly removed the untouched champagne glasses and replaced them with fresh coffee near Claire without being asked. The security officers stepped backward toward the hallway, visibly uncomfortable now that they understood what had nearly happened. Richard finally forced himself to speak. Mrs. Whitmore, he began carefully. It appears there were certain details missing from our preparation process. Claire looked at him quietly. No, she replied softly. There were not. Richard paused. The room remained frozen around him. Claire continued in the same calm tone. Your team knew I would attend today? My authorization was approved 6 weeks ago. Daniel immediately looked toward the coordinator near the door. The young man nodded nervously. The clearance did arrive through executive channels. Richard closed his eyes briefly. The realization hit harder now because it exposed something worse than a simple mistake. They had not ignored Claire because they lacked information. They ignored her because of what they assumed she was the moment they saw her. Claire slowly stood from her chair for the first time all afternoon. The movement alone changed the energy of the room. Powerful people who had dismissed her earlier now watched her carefully, almost anxiously. She stepped toward the giant digital screen displaying the merger projections and rested one hand lightly against the edge of the conference table. Thomas Whitaker built this company with a very simple principle, she said quietly. Never allow arrogance to enter a room before integrity. Nobody interrupted her. Not Richard. Not Victoria. Not anyone. Claire's eyes moved slowly. Across the table, meeting each executive one at a time. Today, she continued, I wanted to see whether anyone here still remembered that. A heavy hush settled across the room once again. Because deep down, every person there suddenly understood the same terrifying truth. This meeting had never been about the merger. It had been a test, and almost everyone in that room had already failed it. Nobody in the conference suite spoke after Claire Whitmore finished her sentence. The quiet that followed felt heavier than any argument that could have erupted inside the room. Outside the towering windows, snow continued falling over Manhattan in slow drifting waves, while muted gray light settled deeper across the skyline. Inside, the world's most powerful investors sat frozen around the long walnut table, each realizing the same humiliating truth at the same moment. They had spent hours dismissing the one person whose approval mattered most. Richard Hale slowly loosened his grip against the edge of the table. For the first time in years, he no longer looked like the man controlling the room. He looked like someone desperately trying to recover from a mistake already too large to erase. Mrs. Whitmore, he began carefully, his tone softer now. If there has been any disrespect today, I assure you it was never intentional. Claire looked toward him quietly. Most disrespect is not intentional, she replied. That is what makes it dangerous. Nobody moved after she said it. Daniel Brooks lowered his eyes toward the table. Victoria Lang stared silently at the reflection of the city lights against the glass wall beside her. Even Ethan Mercer appeared unable to meet Claire's gaze anymore. The confidence that had filled the room earlier that afternoon had disappeared completely. Claire slowly walked toward the far side of the conference suite, where the massive digital display continued showing projections for the Singapore merger. Billions of dollars in projected profits glowed across the screen in cold blue numbers. She studied them silently for several seconds before speaking again. Thomas Whitaker spent 32 years building this company, she said softly. He believed infrastructure was not only about money. It was about trust, stability, character. Richard swallowed hard. Claire turned toward the room again. The moment leadership begins valuing appearances more than integrity, collapse has already begun. The words settled heavily across every seat at the table. Richard finally stepped forward. Claire, he said, abandoning formal titles now. Perhaps we should restart this conversation properly. Claire gave a faint, almost sorrowful smile. That opportunity existed 3 hours ago. A painful silence followed. Richard's voice lowered further. Please understand the pressure involved in negotiations of this scale. Claire nodded gently. I understand pressure very well. Then her eyes drifted briefly toward the old photograph still resting near the center of the table. I also understand loyalty. Something this room seems to have forgotten. Daniel Brooks finally spoke carefully. Mrs. Whitmore, are you saying you no longer support the merger? Nobody breathed. Claire walked slowly back toward her chair and picked up the thin folder resting beside her untouched coffee. The sound of paper against polished wood echoed sharply in the silent room. Then she opened the folder and removed a single signed authorization sheet. Richard immediately recognized the document. It was the final approval required to release the Singapore infrastructure transfer. Without it, the merger could not proceed. Claire held the paper calmly in her hands while every executive at the table watched her. This morning, she said softly, I arrived prepared to sign. The room remained completely still. Then Claire carefully closed the folder again. Now, she continued, I am no longer convinced the people leading this company understand what they are leading. Richard's face tightened with panic he could no longer fully hide. Claire, please. It was the first time all day anyone in the room had spoken to her without arrogance. But it came too late. Claire placed the unsigned authorization document back inside the folder and rested it gently against the table. One quiet movement, one decision, and suddenly the $14 billion merger that had brought the world's elite together inside that luxurious Manhattan conference suite began collapsing in complete silence. No one tried to stop Claire Whitmore as she closed the folder containing the unsigned authorization papers. The room had moved beyond argument now, beyond negotiation. What remained inside the private Manhattan conference suite was something far heavier than financial panic. It was shame. The kind powerful people rarely experienced because they spent most of their lives protected from it. Richard Hale stood motionless near the center of the table while the billion-dollar projections continued glowing uselessly across the massive digital display behind him. Snow pressed softly against the windows overlooking the city skyline, muting the world outside into pale silver and gray. Inside the room, nobody seemed willing to speak first. Claire calmly picked up her worn handbag from beside the chair where she had spent the afternoon being ignored. The same chair no one had wanted her sitting in only hours earlier. Victoria Lang finally stood. Mrs. Whitmore, she said quietly, on behalf of everyone here, I believe we owe you an apology. Claire paused before answering. An apology is valuable when it changes behavior, she replied softly. Otherwise, it is only a performance. Victoria lowered her eyes immediately. Daniel Brooks removed the merger documents from in front of him and folded his hands together in silence. Ethan Mercer stared toward the city beyond the glass walls, unable to hide the regret across his face. Richard stepped forward at last. His voice sounded smaller now, stripped of the confidence that had filled the room earlier that day. Claire, Thomas never mentioned your involvement publicly. Claire looked toward him calmly. Thomas spent his life protecting the company from people who believed power and wisdom were the same thing. Richard said nothing, because deep down, he understood exactly what she meant. Claire slowly reached for the old photograph, still resting near the center of the table. Her fingers brushed gently across the worn edges before she placed it back into her handbag. 30 years ago, she said quietly. There were only 3 folding chairs, 1 borrowed truck, and an empty warehouse in Baltimore. Several executives listened carefully now, almost afraid to interrupt. Thomas built this company with people who knew what it meant to struggle. People who respected workers, receptionists, drivers, assistants. Because he believed the way you treat invisible people reveals who you really are. A hush settled over the room again. Claire looked slowly around the table one final time. Today I walked into this room dressed exactly the same way I have dressed for years, she continued softly. The only thing that changed was what you assumed I was worth. Nobody could argue with her. Not after everything that had happened. Richard finally lowered his eyes toward the polished marble floor beneath him. For perhaps the first time in decades, the most powerful man in the room looked genuinely humbled. Claire gave him a long, quiet look before speaking again. I am not canceling the merger because of disrespect, she said. Several heads lifted immediately. I am canceling it because arrogance eventually destroys every institution that allows it to survive unchecked. The sentence settled across the room like final judgment. Then Claire turned toward the doors and began walking away. No security followed her now. No one questioned her presence. The executives who had once dismissed her stepped aside silently as she passed. The sound of her heels echoed softly across the marble floor while snow continued falling over Manhattan beyond the glass towers. Just before reaching the exit, Claire stopped without turning around. Thomas used to say something before every major deal, she said quietly. The room remained completely still behind her. If a person needs status to recognize dignity, they were never qualified to lead in the first place. Then she walked out of the conference suite without looking back. And long after the elevator doors closed and the sound of her footsteps disappeared, the room remained silent.